Two men. Opposite sides of the globe. Opposite visions for the world order. And yet, they agree on one thing. The Strait of Hormuz must stay open. Welcome back. If you've been following the war in the Middle East, the tensions between Iran and the West, the oil markets, the naval standoffs, then you already know that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is the most strategically dangerous choke point on Earth. And right now, something extraordinary is happening in the diplomatic world. China, not a neutral party, not a bystander, has stepped into the center of war diplomacy. And for the first time in recent memory, Washington and Beijing are not just talking past each other. They are, quietly, aligning. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what is happening at the Strait of Hormuz, why both Trump and Xi Jinping are saying it must stay open, what China's entry into this diplomacy really means for the world, and what the hidden stakes are, for oil, for war, and for the future of global power. Stay with me, because this story is far bigger than it looks on the surface. And if this is the kind of geopolitical depth you want, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we go deep here. Let's start with geography, because you cannot understand this story without understanding why a 21-mile wide channel changes everything. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran on one side, and the United Arab Emirates and Oman on the other. Every single day, approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through this strait. That is roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil. 20% of all oil consumed on the planet. Saudi Arabia's oil goes through here. Iraq's oil goes through here. Kuwait's oil goes through here. The UAE's oil goes through here. Now, what happens if it closes? Within days, global oil prices would spike to levels not seen in modern history. Economists have estimated figures ranging from $150 to $300 per barrel in a worst-case scenario. Global supply chains, already fragile since COVID, would fracture. Europe, which has been trying to diversify energy, would face a crisis. And Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, India, would be hit hardest of all, because Asia is the primary destination of Persian Gulf oil. This is why every major power on Earth has a stake in what happens at this strait. This is why Hormuz is not just a military concern, it is an economic lifeline for civilization. And this is why, when both Donald Trump and Xi Jinping say it must stay open, the world should stop and listen. Now, who has the power to close the Strait of Hormuz? Iran. For decades, Tehran has held the world's most valuable choke point within reach of its missiles, its mines, its naval forces, and its asymmetric warfare doctrine. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has made it explicitly clear, repeatedly, that if Iran is attacked, or if sanctions become intolerable, they have both the capability and the willingness to shut down Hormuz. And they mean it. In 2019, Iran seized a British-flagged oil tanker in the strait and held it for weeks. In 2023 and 2024, as the conflict in Gaza escalated and the Houthi attacks on shipping began in the Red Sea, Iran's hand in regional destabilization became harder to deny. The Houthis in Yemen, attacking commercial and military ships in the Red Sea, are not acting alone. They are part of what Iran calls the axis of resistance. So when Washington looks at the threat to freedom of navigation, in the Red Sea and at Hormuz, they see one connected strategy. One hand pulling multiple strings. One power with one goal, leverage. Here is what's important to understand. Under the Trump administration's second term, the pressure on Iran has reached a level of intensity not seen since the maximum pressure campaign of 2018. Sanctions have been retightened. Military posturing in the Gulf has intensified. And behind closed doors, the conversations about Iran's nuclear program have become more urgent, more dangerous. This is the context. This is why the Strait of Hormuz has become ground zero for the world's most dangerous diplomatic standoff. And this is why China's entry onto this stage is not just surprising, it is seismic. Here is the piece of this puzzle that most Western media misses. When people talk about China's global power, they talk about its military growth, its technology, its belt and road infrastructure, its trade dominance. What they talk about less is China's profound, structural dependency on Persian Gulf oil. China is the world's largest oil importer, and the vast majority of that oil comes from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and the UAE. Every single one of those barrels must pass through, or near, the Strait of Hormuz. So here is the uncomfortable truth that Beijing must sit with. For all of China's power, for all of its military expansion, for all of its diplomatic reach, its economy, its factories, its manufacturing machine, the engine of the Chinese century, depends on a 21-mile stretch of water that it does not control. That it cannot protect. That an adversarial power, Iran, sits directly above. This is China's strategic nightmare. And it explains something that has puzzled analysts for years: why China, despite being Iran's largest trading partner and closest diplomatic backer, has quietly told Tehran, again and again, do not close the strait. The relationship between China and Iran is real. The trade is real. The diplomatic backing at the UN Security Council is real. But even China has a line. And that line is drawn at the Strait of Hormuz. Because beyond that line, there is no China strategy, no Belt and Road vision, no industrial superpower, only a country whose economy is starved of the energy it needs to function. Let's talk about where the Trump administration stands. Under Trump's second term, the approach to Iran has been clear: maximum pressure, economic strangulation, and military signaling. The goal, as stated publicly and privately, is to force Tehran to the negotiating table on three issues: nuclear weapons, regional proxies, and freedom of navigation. But here is where it gets complicated. Maximum pressure, pushed too far, can produce two outcomes. Either Iran bends, or Iran breaks, and chooses a path of escalation so dramatic that it cannot be walked back. Senior military analysts, former CIA officials, and Middle East policy veterans have warned, consistently, that a cornered Iran is a dangerous Iran. And a dangerous Iran with one hand near the Hormuz switch, that is an Iran that changes everything. Oil markets know this. Shipping companies know this. And the strategists in the Pentagon and the National Security Council know this too. The Trump administration knows that the tool of maximum pressure, while powerful, carries a fuse attached to the most economically sensitive waterway in the world. Which is why, even as they tighten the screws economically and maintain military dominance in the Gulf, they have been careful to signal one consistent message: we do not want Hormuz closed. And behind closed doors, through back channels, through third-party intermediaries, through diplomatic signals that never make the front pages, that message has reportedly been transmitted to Beijing. With an ask. If China has influence over Iran, and it does, use it. Tell Tehran, Hormuz must stay open. This is the part of the story that has been happening in the shadows. And it is the most consequential development in Middle East geopolitics since the Abraham Accords. In 2023, China brokered a historic diplomatic normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two regional powers that had been in a state of Cold War for nearly a decade. The world took notice. Beijing had done something Washington couldn't, or wouldn't. It had brought two bitter rivals to the same room and produced a deal. Since then, China's role as a Middle East diplomatic actor has only grown, and its credibility as a broker, particularly with Tehran, has become one of its most valuable geopolitical assets. Now, as tensions at Hormuz have reached a new peak, China has reportedly been engaged in quiet but intensive diplomatic communication with Tehran. What is Beijing telling Iran? Based on what we know from public statements, diplomatic sources, and the broader strategic logic, China is telling Iran that closing the strait, or even seriously threatening it, would be a catastrophic mistake. Not just because it would draw an overwhelming US military response, but because it would destroy the economic foundation of the one major power that has stood beside Iran through decade after decade of Western sanctions. China's message to Iran, in essence, is this: We are your partner, we have protected you at the UN, we buy your oil when no one else will, but if you close Hormuz, you don't just hurt America. You cut the artery that feeds us. And now, here is where the extraordinary alignment with Washington comes in. Because while Trump and Xi Jinping disagree on virtually everything, trade, Taiwan, technology, human rights, the future of the international order, on this one point, their strategic interests are perfectly, almost eerily aligned. Neither the United States nor China can afford a closed Strait of Hormuz. This shared interest has reportedly produced quiet, back-channel communication between the two superpowers. Not a formal agreement. Not a treaty. Not a joint statement. But a quiet, implicit understanding: Hormuz must stay open. And both sides will use whatever leverage they have to ensure it. Now let's zoom out. Because what is happening here is not just about one strait or one diplomatic moment. It is a window into the emerging architecture of 21st century great power relations. For the past decade, the dominant narrative has been one of inevitable confrontation between the United States and China, the new Cold War, the Thucydides trap, decoupling, containment. And none of that is wrong. The competition is real. The tensions are real. The potential for catastrophic conflict over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over technology, that is all very real. But what the Hormuz alignment shows us is something more nuanced. Even in a world of strategic competition, there are zones of overlapping interest, places where two rival superpowers look at the map and realize that neither of them benefits from what happens if this goes wrong. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. And the fact that Trump's Washington and Xi's Beijing are, quietly, carefully, without fanfare, coordinating to prevent an Iranian miscalculation from igniting a global economic catastrophe tells us something important. It tells us that great powers, even hostile ones, can exercise restraint when the stakes are high enough. But here is the shadow question, the one that haunts every analyst who watches this space. What happens if Iran doesn't listen? What happens if Tehran, pushed to the edge by sanctions, by domestic pressure, by the logic of defiance, decides that the one card they hold, the one thing that concentrates the world's attention, is the Strait of Hormuz? Then the alignment between Washington and Beijing becomes its most severe test. Because at that point, both superpowers would face a choice: do they stand together to reopen the strait, potentially through military force? Or does the competition between them ultimately override the shared interest? That question has no clear answer. And the uncertainty of that answer is precisely what makes the current diplomacy so fragile, so urgent, and so deeply consequential. Let's bring this together. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature. It is the single most important choke point in the global economy, with 20% of the world's oil passing through it every single day. Iran sits astride it, and has both the will and the capability to threaten it. China, despite being Iran's closest major partner, has a profound economic vulnerability to any closure of the strait, because Chinese prosperity, quite literally, depends on those waters staying open. The Trump administration, applying maximum pressure on Iran, has been quietly signaling to Beijing: use your influence, keep Iran from doing the unthinkable. And in a development that should be headline news everywhere, Beijing appears to be listening. And acting. For the first time in years, Washington and Beijing are not just rivals. On this specific, narrow, vital question, they are quietly on the same side. What does that mean? It means that even in a world hurtling toward multipolar conflict, there are still moments where shared vulnerability produces shared purpose. It means that diplomacy, quiet, unglamorous, back-channel diplomacy, still matters. And it means that the Strait of Hormuz remains what it has always been, a mirror that reflects the true nature of global power. Not as it is proclaimed in speeches and summits, but as it actually operates, in the dark, in the margins, in the spaces between war and peace. The ships are still moving tonight. The oil is still flowing. And in the corridors of power in Washington and Beijing, two rival superpowers are holding their breath, hoping it stays that way. Thank you for watching. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about the war in the Middle East, the US-China relationship, or what the Strait of Hormuz really means for all of us, please like this video, because it helps more people find this content. Subscribe if you want to understand world events at this level, not just headlines, but the real forces underneath them. And drop your answer in the comments to this question: if Iran did close the Strait of Hormuz, do you believe the United States and China would actually work together to reopen it, or would their rivalry ultimately win out? I want to hear your analysis. I'll see you in the next one.